I will be sitting because I think that our colleagues will see me better, and I think that you all can see me if I'm sitting. Is that correct? Right. So the presentation of today is on one research project that we have just concluded. Actually, we are at the phase where we are writing the report. And we have one of the publications is the one you had to read for today, which is in press already accepted, but we will have for sure some other in progress that we, as soon as we have written the report, we will go on that. As you can see, it is a SHIRK project. It was an insight to development grant, which was 2 to 3 years. And the title I have given for today is a successful innovation in language teaching, a comparative study. You will see because it compares 2 different countries. So, okay, this is the overview of the talk. The researcher was focusing on the implementation of the Common European Framework for Reference in 2 different realities. How many of you are familiar, or at least have heard about the Common European Framework of Reference? Most of you. Yeah, most of you, not everybody. Maybe very quickly, and then we will have time to discuss more. The Common European Framework of Reference is a document that has been published already around 20 years ago. It was a document that covers both political like language policy aspects and assessment and methodology linked to the teaching and learning of second foreign languages. It was published by the Council of Europe, and it was the result of a long research project involving many researchers and practitioners, and it is always quoted as Common European Framework 2001. Council of Europe 2001 Common European Framework of Reference, because it was the product of a team, a group of people. So because it has also, as I said, a political dimension and not just a research dimension, it's not indicated with the name of the authors, because it's not just a research, but it's a document that had the ambition of influencing the teaching and learning of languages. And it was very effective in that, because within 20 years, it is no longer European, it is really a Word document, because it has been used and it is being used in the different continents, and with some adaptations, but basically as is. It has been translated into 40 languages, and it is being used from, from Japan to North and South America to different countries in Europe, African countries, etc. And even Australia is interested in doing and using it. But it's not used everywhere in an institutional way. It is used in an institutional way in most of the European countries, but not in all. And then it is used by pockets of like researchers and practitioners. For example, in the US, there is an interest, but it is not used institutionally, also because the US have another scale that was developed by ACTFL, and so if anything, this is more used institutionally. But the good point also is that all these other scales are trying or have already tried to compare with the scale of the CEFR, both in Canada with the Canadian language benchmarks that you've probably heard of, or some of you may be very familiar with that, and there has been a project to compare and understand where the two scales compare, and there is something similar for actual that is going on. So as I said, it's way more than European. It's now a reference framework. This reference framework has been used mainly for the levels, the scale. This has been done, like people know that. They know that it goes from A1 to C2, A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. They know that there are descriptors. What has been much less known for is its pedagogical dimension. And even in the implementation of the levels, it has not been done thoroughly and in the same way and with the same kind of success in the different realities. So what we wanted to do is to compare two realities that are very significant, Switzerland and Canada. And I will ask you why these two countries. And so I will tell you more about that in our point 2. Our third point goes into our research methodology. So what kind of research questions did we have, and what kind of methodology did we use in this research? And then some results from our data, both from the quantitative and the qualitative analysis, and the summary. The idea of having indicators is because we want to do something more than just analyzing data. We want to create something, and this we are creating it right now, that we can then write in a very accessible form to be sent to stakeholders. So people who are not necessarily in research, but they can find some help in having some guidance in the way they can foster innovation in their language classroom using the Common European Framework. Okay? So that's our overview. Doesn't look like going with the arrow, but in this way it goes. So as I said, the Common European Framework is used around the world. This was of 2000, like 5 years ago or 6 years ago. And you see all the red areas is where it is being used. But I had a talk last summer, and a colleague from one African country said, oh, but Africa is all white there. But there are many more realities that I know where it is being used. And I said, yes, I'm sorry, this is all I found so far, but this is less than what it is in reality. But just to give you a sense that it has been used. And as I said, it has been translated into many languages. And every time you see the logo of the Council of Europe, this little C with the stars, not to mix the Council of Europe with the European Union. People here, this side of the pond, have very often a big confusion between the two, including researchers that write articles where they totally mix the Council of Europe with the European Union. The Council of Europe is much broader. It includes many more countries than the European Union, includes, for example, Russia and Iceland, etc. So countries that are not part of the European Union, Switzerland, for example, which is not part of the European Union. It is the oldest institution, oldest European institution. It was created precisely with the idea after the war to help prevent other conflicts, because what the main point is to help have the rule of law, to help states protect human rights and follow the rule of law. The most important institution of the Council of Europe is the European Court of Human Rights. And it's a court where the citizens can appeal if they feel that their own country has not respected their human rights. Of course, these countries need to be members of the Council of Europe. I mean, somebody from a country who's not a member of the Council of Europe cannot appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, even if they feel that the human rights have not been respected. But just to give you a sense, in this moment, you may have read in the news, Russian citizens very often don't feel their human rights are respected. So there has been an enormous increase in appeals to the Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, from Russian citizens who often have had a positive response from the court, you know, have seen their rights restored. So the result in this moment, and I don't know how it is going right now, but last year there was a big problem because Russia didn't contribute its due to the Council of Europe. And you can imagine that this is a big political problem. Like this institution lives because each country contributes according to their economy, their size, etc., number of citizens. I don't know what the parameters are, but if you have one big contributor less, well, that's going to be a problem. And what do you do with an institution that is there to protect the human rights and the rule of law, but it's not a political institution in the sense that it can impose on other countries? So this is where we stand with democracy in this moment. So it's something that we need to bear in mind. Okay, what did the CEFR do? I already said something, but if we had to summarize it into one slide, this would be, it provides a clear organization of second foreign language proficiency around these 6 levels, expressed through can-do statements and descriptors, and used to describe communicative language activities of reception, production, interaction, and mediation. Those were already my students in the second language methodology course, know very well that this is very different from the 4 skills, listening, reading, speaking, and writing. It's much broader, and it gives much more space to interaction, to co-construction of discourse, to intercultural communication, etc. All these are in the written and oral. They are accomplished in meaningful real-life tasks. We talk about action-oriented approach, and to these tasks and these proficiency contribute to different competencies that are linguistic, what we know, can be grammatical, vocabulary, etc., but also pragmatic and sociolinguistic competencies and general competencies. Like every person is seen in a holistic way, having, yes, linguistic competencies, but also competencies that you acquire through life, you know, not necessarily just through the study of language. And they all contribute. What has done the CEFR so far? Well, it has been a catalyst for changing the perspective, adopting a backward design. What is a backward design? Is like you have your goal in mind, and from there you start back planning, saying, okay, I wanted at the end of 3 months my student be able to do that. What can I do in order to bring them there so that they will be successful in doing these tasks? This is totally different from starting saying, okay, I have to teach in French the passé composé, the future, and the passive. And I'm organizing the stuff around these 3 points in grammar. Is a totally different way of planning. And this resulted in curriculum reform, in the idea of a transparency in assessment, because if you say, okay, I want my student to be there at the end of 3 months, you have also to create a way of proving through assessment that they were successful and that you were successful with your teaching. So you have to have clear criteria, transparent, so that the student know exactly what they are expected to be doing, and you know exactly what to use in order to assess them. And it's not just a vague impression thing. or a numerical thing. So many mistakes. The perfect note without all those mistakes makes that. No, that's not the idea of the CFR. So it results, therefore, in pedagogical innovation. And what has definitely already achieved, I think, completely this is enhanced communication across contexts and languages. Before the CFR, the teachers of French never talked to the teachers of English or to the teachers of German. They said, oh, no, we have nothing in common. Whereas they do have like 80% in common and 20% different, because it's always teaching languages. Then that you teach English, French, Spanish, Chinese, it's okay. The languages are different, but there is quite a lot in common. Okay. At the same time, it's an unfinished business, because the implementation of the CFR has often been unsystematic and inconsistent. Because, as I said, some states, for example, have said, oh yeah, we will implement it. And it has been a kind of top-down thing. All the exams need to be there. But more often, it has been a bottom-up thing or a mix. Like the state, the ministry has only said, you have to get to the level B1 after that number of years. And all the rest has been done by the teachers. So it has been a kind of mix. So very unsystematic. And above all, there has been a lack of quality assurance, feasibility, and impact studies. We see that we don't know much, actually, because the few studies that have in the title the idea of impact, if you look and read them, they're not done systematically. It's a kind of more anecdotal or impression, and we need that. The quality assurance is one part that we had very much in mind, because if you want to introduce change and innovation, you also have to make sure that you plan in the right way and that you are transparent, and that you can say you have indicators that say that if you have been successful or not. Now, these were really lacking. So what was the result? That there was limited knowledge and expertise transfer between and within countries. Everybody kind of reinvented the wheel, and they didn't look at the other countries saying, oh yeah, they've been working on that for 3 years. They have had these successes and these challenges. What could we do in order to avoid those pitfalls? This is non-existent, and it should be there. This was one of our motivations for doing things. So we chose these two contexts. As I said, we submitted this project, which we got in 2015, and it was a 2+1 year. And the idea was to be in a group where we shared the different expertise, academic research, knowledge of quality assurance processes, and education and administration experience. And what was interesting, because sometimes in life things happen at the same time, I had also applied for a European project with the European Center of Modern Languages, which is part of the Council of Europe, in charge of basically helping practitioners to implement some of the ideas and research that is being produced both by the Council of Europe and other researchers and bodies. And so we had a kind of sister project that is finished now, and we produced a quality matrix. It's called Quality Matrix. That is a kind of online tool that helps stakeholders really to do a long process along a thorough, I would say, process of understanding what are the issues, how they could go about that, and how they can work in a more, let's say, productive, effective way. And It's very interesting. I will show it to you and provided the link. And then if you have some time, you can try and play a little bit with it and pretend you are either a teacher or a teacher educator or a principal and say, I want to introduce change in my class. I want to introduce change in my school. And respond to all the questions, and then you will have a profile that is created by the system that tells you, hey, you're pretty strong in this area, but you're not yet strong in that. So these indicators have been cross-referenced with good practices. We have collected a series of practices in many countries, and we have classified them and schematized. And so you can say, hey, you're not very strong in this. Go and look at these two practices. They will probably give you good ideas. So it's a kind of bottom-up thing. We're not telling you, oh, you have to do that. No, somebody's been successful in this area, and they have done this way. So maybe if you look at that, you can find good ideas. But this is not what I'm going to talk about today. So if you think at Switzerland and Canada and you see this, you say, hey, what are you comparing there? Look at the size. Switzerland is tiny and Canada is huge. And you may say, okay, where is the logic here? Well, there is a lot of logic. The first thing is that these two countries have a non-centralized education. I mean, the education is not all done in Ottawa for the entire country, or in Switzerland Central, or in Bern for Switzerland, but it's done in the different provinces that are independent. And the same thing happens to Switzerland. It is done in the different cantons. And you can see, it's, even if it is tiny, there is always a scale. You can always have a tinier. So there are the different cantons. But they also have something else in common. They have more than one official language. Canada too, and Switzerland has actually 4 basically, because one is German, French, Italian, and Romansh, which is also a Neo-Latin language spoken by few people in the valleys, but it exists. And another thing that they have in common, these two countries, they have a rate of immigration that is very high. One of the highest in the world, and so they receive a lot of people with other languages, and so there is a presence of heritage languages. They are not always called the heritage languages, sometimes langue d'origine or other, but still the idea is the same. So, and these are the commonalities of in spite of the difference in size. But the big difference and interesting for us was that Switzerland was the first country to implement the CEFR. Actually, it was the cradle, basically, of the CEFR. When they started with the idea of the CEFR, they started in Rochlikon, which is a little city near Zurich, where they had a big conference, and they said, we need. It was just after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was 91. So Europe was really becoming much more open, and there was a lot of mobility. And already in a country like Switzerland with many languages, there was really this idea, what does it mean? I'm beginner, intermediate, I'm fluent, I'm native speaker. What does that mean? How can the mobility, what kind of job can I give to this person instead of another, you know? So they needed some transparency. Initially, that was only the idea. It was, okay, let's put some transparency. But then the coordinator of the project was Professor John Trim, from England. He said, hey, we have an opportunity here, much more than just doing something that shows the same level. We can really think of something like a framework that will foster innovation. And he was very forward-looking. And I must say that what he said is still bearing fruits now. you see, because in 2014, there was a new project, and there was a kind of update of the CEFR, which is called the CEFR Companion Volume, with new descriptors for mediation, new descriptors for phonological competence, for online communication, etc., etc. So what TRIM started was really a process, and what the team did. So the cradle of the CEFR, and on the other side, one of the newcomers in the CEFR, because Canada has started to be interested in the CEFR after Larry van der Grift, who was a professor at the University of Ottawa, did a report, was commissioned to do a report to say what he thought would be a good framework for Canada. And he suggested the CEFR. And he said, considering all the characteristics of this framework, I think that it would be very suitable for our reality. And since 2007, little by little, the different provinces, etc., with differences. Some were more resistant, some had the two phases, like British Columbia had a very enthusiastic phase, and they started to redo their curriculum. Then the government changed, and the other government said, oh no, we don't want that. So all the work was lost, and then now are getting back to having again interest, but they have to change things. So in Ontario, for example, there was a big interest for French and for the international languages, much less for ESL, because something was developed locally for ESL. So see, the different provinces have had a different attitude, but basically in Canada, since the Larry van der Grift report, the interest has increased. Okay, so let's see how we formulated our research and what kind of research, first of all. It was a mixed research because we wanted an interdisciplinary perspective. On one side, we wanted to use design-based research. That means combining empirical research with theory-driven design by developing tools and developing them in collaboration with researchers and practitioners. So this was the idea. We didn't position ourselves with the design-based research. You never position yourself as the authority. We do things and then we give it to the practitioners, and they do and they implement. You try to see what they think, what are their beliefs, what are the problems, and you try to develop something in a back and forth movement, and so that then you hope, or usually it works, that they will feel more ownership of what has been developed. And we wanted to have always this perspective of the quality assurance, which is used in different areas, including business, you know, just to see if the product that you developed responds to the standards. If you can say, yes, that's exactly what I wanted and not a different thing. These were our research questions. So what procedures were used to introduce CEFR implementation? Has a QA, a quality assurance approach, or at least elements of this approach informed the CEFR implementation or not? What were the successful strategies and procedure, more successful than others? And what aspects do these successful strategies and procedures share, which would be recast in a generic quality assurance frame? Like, basically, you see, is like have a picture, a snapshot of what happened, what was considered successful, distill all that into something that could be then reused for creating a tool that would help other people in the implementation. That was the idea. It's a kind of curve. How did we do? We used a multi-phase mixed method research design, and here are the phases. First, we called it a comparative phase because we kind of started by the usual, searching documents and analyzing, seeing, okay, there have been several documents that have been produced by the different ministries of education, some textbooks, some guides, etc. And we looked at them. But the bulk of the first phase was the semi-structured interviews. We interviewed people in Switzerland and in Canada, in person in Switzerland and partially in person and a lot online in Canada due to the distances. And then more recently, we added an online survey that to cover for the quantitative part, where we send the survey to the people who had been interviewed, the participants, and to other people, I will tell you, other practitioners and researchers. And we have this comparative phase, always with a QA phase, like how can we conceptualize and develop guidelines? And we are working to finalize this phase. How many people did we have? Our sample, as you can see, was 28 people in Canada and 16 in Switzerland, which was quite a good sample because they were people with a lot of responsibility usually. Like they were people who were in charge of big projects and they were knowledgeable of relatively big areas. They were not like anybody, and they had a different roles. See, administrator, program coordinator, teacher education, researcher, teacher, consultant. So they had different roles so that we could have a sense of the different people involved. We collected, transcribed, and then coded all the interviews using the software Nvivo. And just to give you a sense, that as usual is a lot of work, and it's not only the practical work of transcribing, but also finding the right nodes is not an easy process. It's something that you do little by little. First, you kind of brainstorm possible nodes, and then you try and reach a consensus of the different researchers, and then you kind of reduce them to what are really the nodes that you think are useful. And just to give you a sense of what we had different nodes, as you can see. And for example, if we take modalities and quality assurance procedure and involvement and support, which is something that we will be well, we won't talk. Yeah, we will talk about these three then when I show you the results. And you see, just to give you a sense, it's not just modalities and procedure. The little plus you have on the left means that you have kind of sub nodes. So these were the nodes, and then each of them, apart from advice, was subdivided into different ones. So see, for example, the modalities that resulted from what we had were teacher education, classroom trial, external exams, collaborative groups, data collection, portfolios, textbooks, and pedagogical materials. Different modalities for implementation of the CFR and innovation through the CFR. What if they had any QA procedure? What kind of procedures were there? They were planning, developing, piloting, disseminating, evaluating, having or not having scientific accompaniment. These were what we found, what we identified as possible QA procedure. And the involvement that we had at the bottom, see, involvement and support was subdivided into subnodes like teachers' involvement or lack of teachers' involvement, administrator support or lack of administrator support, because this would give us something interesting then later. Okay, so let's have a look at the success factor, this part, success factors, negative advice and impacts. And I give you a sense, yeah, just trying to policy. See, how was it used? Well, if you look at the two pie charts, you see that it was used for well, more or less the same as far as curriculum alignment and alignment is concerned, but there was a difference in the teaching and assessment. So in Switzerland, it was more used for assessment and less in its pedagogical part. And in Canada, it was the reverse. Because what we noticed was that very often in Canada, assessment was a bit of a blocked thing. It was done more top down with other tools that didn't necessarily allow always to start from assessment, whereas in Switzerland, they started very often with the assessment. And it was, on the contrary, this liberated some space, freed some space for going more into the teaching, into the methodologies, and less space on that in Switzerland. Although, as we will see, assessment in the end played a big role also in Canada through external exams, but I will get there in a moment. And this is connected to the parts they were referring to. What parts of the CEFR are you introducing more, are you using more? See, again, the communicative action-oriented approach came up much more in Canada than in Switzerland, where the can-do descriptors and the evaluation with defined criteria was stronger. It's a kind of more, how can I say, more balanced between the three. And in Canada is much more, it's more important, the teaching part. And then the other parts were the levels, the competencies, the plurilingualism, etc. With Nvivo, you can have queries. You can mix, you can put together different aspects and see matrix queries. What does it give? So we analyzed together the modalities and QA procedure and involvement in relation to successful or unsuccessful strategies, like which strategies were more or less successful in relation to modalities, to QA procedures, and to involvement. Is everything clear so far? Yeah? So, and this, it gave this. Now, you don't have to think of the numerical value. We didn't have numerical. It's just to give you a sense of what was indicated as more successful or less successful. In Canada, we saw that teacher education, and I think I have arrows? No, I don't. It's in the other one. Teacher education and external exams come up very high. Collaborative groups come very high, and the dissemination aspects and the teacher involvement. In Switzerland, we see that some are similar. So if you see the teacher education is very strong in Switzerland too, a bit less, but still pretty strong. But what is interesting is that the external exams in Switzerland are not that important as in Canada. See, in Canada, we have a big presence of the external exam. The introduction of the DELF exam is an exam for French as a second language, was really a catalyst of change and of introduction of the CEFR in the classes. Basically, it was like, okay, let's introduce an external exam, and then it trickled down change in the way the teachers taught, in the way they started to see things, and the process is still ongoing. In Switzerland, this was only partially true because there was another modality. It was more through the institution. So there was some effect of the external exams, but not so strong as in Canada. But the dissemination, see, was very strong as one successful strategy used, more than in Canada. Although even in Canada is pretty strong. One thing you can have a look at is portfolios in Canada are considered more successful strategy, and look in Switzerland, they are as successful as unsuccessful. Well, this is due to what we could call a fatigue effect of portfolios. As I said, Switzerland has been introducing the CFR very often, and there's been one thing that has happened. When they produced the CFR, at the same time, they produced the European language portfolio. To me, personally, this was a big mistake, because in a sense, the portfolio looks much more user-friendly. You have your checklist, I do that, I do that. This was a kind of barrier, and the CFR, honestly, is not an easy thing to digest. It's pretty, the one, 2001, the new one is much better, but the original is pretty tough to digest. There's really a bit of jargon, etc. Whereas the portfolio was kind of the friendly face of the CFR. But the point is that if you don't understand the logic behind the CFR, the concepts, applying the portfolio remains a bit of a surface thing. And it can be a bit of a boomerang, because after a while, you reflect on your learning process, fine, but then so what? In the end, the teacher said, okay, we keep having this extra burden, which is the portfolio. This doesn't happen in Canada because the process is new. And probably now it's much better to introduce the portfolio because there is much more understanding of the CFR than there was in 2001. Okay, so just to give you a sense of this data, how they can be interpreted. Another matrix query was with the successful with the successful strategies and positive impact. So, and again, that's interesting because you see, successful strategies used in Canada, that teacher education was both a successful strategy and had a positive impact, comes pretty clear. Same thing with this idea of the external exams, dissemination, and the teacher's involvement. And in Switzerland, it is at the end of the day, pretty similar for certain aspects. Again, dissemination is even stronger, but you can see that teacher education is considered a successful strategy with positive impact. Dissemination is positive and successful, and teachers' involvement, same story. So the big difference is these external exams. As I said, that was not considered that important in Switzerland, although it existed, but it was not put as having the major impact. If we go, as in every qualitative research, you report the participant's voice. And here you have some of the participant voice, which is pretty interesting, I think, because teachers started asking themselves, what needs to happen in the classroom for this to happen? Was what I said at the very beginning. Instead of starting with the point of grammar, if you start with this idea that you want your student to be able to, I don't know, organize a journey in a country with certain constraints of money, time, etc., they needed to be able to read the documents, discuss something, see what happens, etc. And so as a teacher, you say, what do I need to do before in order for them to be successful with that? Or link it as closely as possible to the teacher's everyday life, bringing in their experiences because they are very aware of, I don't want to be corrected, I do my job properly enough, I just want to have new ideas. This was a bit the feeling of the teachers. They didn't want to have something parachuted on their head. They said, I know what I'm doing, give me just the new ideas. So that meant that they had to experience this feasibility of change, the fact that you can change little by little together. You don't need just to completely throw away what you were doing until that moment, but just change step by step. And then they said, here, Lingua Level is a very good project, a very good project that they had in Switzerland. And it says it was so helpful to have 200 teachers involved in Lingua Level. They could say, no, forget it. This is something we don't do in class. Like, being very practical. 200 for Switzerland is a very high number. So means that to develop this tool, they had a lot of people on board, and each could say, hey, this is feasible, this is not feasible in the class. So that there was this kind of experience. And then the trainee teachers have to experience what they are going to teach to their students. That's interesting, no? Like modeling. Another point was this idea of a backward design as a catalyst of change. As I said, this is Canada. The DELF is the catalyst, the vehicle of implementation of the CFR, because once you get that up and happening, it trickles down to levels, institutional practices, etc. That's what the teachers told us. In schools that are resistant to change, like in Switzerland is the Licei, you know, it's like the more academic secondary school. These exams have a positive washback effect. See, even if we didn't see the exams as one of the top thing, but in some realities they still had that important impact. And this is good washback in relation to the Licei, where the exams shake things up, and parents are also in favor of this more pragmatic approach to language rather than just literature, because literature is taught in the Licei a lot. They start to rethink the way the language is being learned and taught. They start to understand there has to be a shift, start to question how they do things. This we heard quite a lot, that this implementation was sometimes worrying for the teachers because they understood that it was shaking the ground. What they said is, make it the system, like don't make it something extra. This has to become the system. So if you want to have an impact, you need to have multiple entry points, and every level of the organization has to be playing their role in it. It has to be a full-on. And this is something that is very important, and very often it doesn't happen. There is just a little, it's a kind of shy of very minimal implementation with the idea that you don't want to change too much. But if it doesn't enter as the system, it has very little chances to be effective. And in fact, it says everyone needs to see themselves in this picture. And then they talk about the portfolio, and they say, if the portfolio is always thought of as an extra, as optional, it will not be taken seriously. Students at the Language Center must produce a portfolio in order to complete the program. Being able to constitute an ELP is one of the learning outcomes. See, this has been a major problem. If you have always an add-on, the teachers say, hey, I have already my assessment. Why do you want me to do a portfolio on top, or the students? Whereas if that becomes one of the assessment, then it's another story. Huh? But to accept a portfolio evaluation, you have to let go of certain ideas of numerical values and very structured assessment, as if that was the only way of assessing the results. And finally, creating a culture of sustainable change. This was another problem. Like, if it is a one-off, like you come, you do this thing, fine, there are some enthusiasts, but then little by little things will go back to business as usual. If you want to make sustainable change, you have to engage in an ongoing process and not just one workshop. And having things like task forces or cycles where things are repeated over and over. And this we saw in Switzerland, we saw in some of the good examples had that, but even in Canada, see, for example, even in Ontario for French, the ministry is doing that. They have this website where they continue to put resources and they try to train the teachers little. Okay, there's not much on in-service training as there should be, but within the limits that they have, they try to do it an ongoing process. Okay, we're almost at the end. The survey that we had, this is the quantitative part. We prepared after that, after we had analyzed all the qualitative data, etc., and seen what were the points. And here, Amit was very important in this phase because we created a questionnaire out of the data, using the data of the qualitative part. See, this is the idea of this type of research, is a kind of cyclical. It's not like there is one hypothesis, you do all your stuff, you respond. It's changing during, because we couldn't have possibly, when we asked for the ethic approval, you know, they want everything immediately. You will see for your thesis, like you are asking for your filing for your ethic, and you have a, if you say I'm going to use a questionnaire, then they say please attach the questionnaire. Well, you have to do that, but 90% of the time, if it is this type of research, the questionnaire changes. And even if it's more structured and clear, very often it is slightly modified. So when you will have to prepare your, or if you are in that phase, some of you are already there, don't be so afraid, because you can always have an amendment later. So you justify. The people of the ethics are pretty, as I say, are rigid but are flexible. Like they are thorough. It's apropos quality assurance. They want to see quality, but they are flexible. They understand that this kind of research will evolve, and luckily so. So what we did was this: how important do you consider the following points for a successful CFR implementation? And you see, you recognize, no? Stakeholders involvement, quality assurance aspects, and then a part 2, to what extent do you agree with the following pieces of advice? And just to give you an example, from part 1, you have, how important do you consider the following points for a successful CFR implementation? Stakeholders involvement, collaboration among different stakeholders from the initial stages of the CFR implementation process, ensures that all the different perspectives are brought to the table. It's not important for you, or is it extremely important? Where do you situate yourself? What do you think? In part 2, an example, to what extent do you agree with the following pieces of advice? Take your context and its political, sociocultural, academic, and administrative factors into consideration in order to develop an appropriate strategy to implement the most relevant aspect of the CFR. Do you completely agree, or well, probably nobody completely disagree, but for some people, certain things are more important than others. And here, well, I will post this so you will have the chance to read, but just to give you a sense of what were the questions. See, for example, number 7, involving people at the top of both school and central administration provides perceived legitimacy and coherent implementation to the program. It also increases financial and political backing and sustainability. You may say, yeah, well, they will agree with all of that. Well, in a sense, this is true, but remember that this kind of questionnaire wanted both to test what they think and then to help us kind of put them in relation to each other so that we could develop something afterwards. We could say, hey, this is really important. This creates a factor that we have to bear in mind. This is seen as less important. Part 1, part always part one. So part one first was the use of the CFR. No, let's say stakeholders involvement. Use of the CFR related resources. What did you use? How do you? This, for example, gave different responses too. For example, do you agree that the European language portfolio can be a good entry point or not? This is really different from the people who replied. Quality assurance aspects. For example, how important do you think the scientific accompanying by experts is? Some people may say, no, for us it's not very important. For others, yes, this should be. Or again, similar, collaboration between experts and teachers during the project helps to build on teachers' feedback about successes, changes, and potential obstacles. I'm not going to read them all, of course. It's getting smaller and smaller, so the exercise is really, but you will have a sense of what it is. And then, to what extent do you agree with the following pieces of advice? Some are something like, plan a lot of time, be patient and take small steps, etc. Accept that it will be a long and difficult process. Some are more specific, like if possible, set up a national, regional, or official coordination point, which can provide information, expertise, and coordinate the CFR implementation and accreditation processes. So what did we do with, first of all, how many people did we have? Well, we had our Canadian and Switzerland, and as you see, we had more than the initial ones. And then we had others, because it was also disseminated, this questionnaire, through EALTA, for example, the EALTA list survey, European Association for Language Tester and Assessor, and it was an open call, people who had an expertise in the CFR. And of course, there were a bit more from EALTA, because here it was all those who had the expertise, basically we had reached them. And you see, there was Canada, Switzerland, and others. And if we go down to others, we have really many different countries and many different contexts. And we also had, again, different types of institution, participants that had a different profile, role, a different role, teacher education, educator, and working in university, or adult education, or secondary school, elementary school, etc. And the languages, this is an interesting point. Of course, you have a more, if you add them on, it makes more, because people had several languages very often. So they were involved in more than one language, so they could check languages you are concerned with. Some were administrators, so they had like 10 languages, so they checked a different one. But again, you can see that we had a lot, of course, English and French are the biggest, but then German, Spanish, and Italian have quite a lot of numbers, and then all the other languages as well. How did we analyze them? Well, we did with descriptive statistics and the difference of group means and a factor analysis. So basically, these were the methodologies used for the analysis. And what we came up with was that 13 of the 40 indicators had a statistically significant difference between the means. So basically, nine indicators for whom the Canadians have a higher mean than the Swiss and the others, and 4 for which the Swiss have a significantly lower mean. And we will see what they are in a moment. So the principal component analysis identified 10 main factors, which account altogether for 3/3, basically, 2/3 of the data. And these were given labels on the basis of the indicators concerned. And these are those factors, those 10 factors, you see? So you have things like proper long-term planning involving teachers and experts from the outset, which really stood out as a very important factor. And then all the others had also quite a big of importance. And you see, you can recognize some of the things we've been discussing in another form. See, and it's this is an interesting point. And again, we have the indicators here. So we had the variance first, and then the indicators. And later we have the most important, basically the core ones. This in factor 1, 3, 5, and 8, and then in comparison to the others. See, you recognize them. And then we had the others one where there was a difference, where basically these were the common ones, or where the significance difference is equal to 0, and the other one where there was difference because Canada was higher or Switzerland was lower. You can see them, the factor and the text of the indicators with the significance difference of means. And we can discuss that later more and this is the continuation of that. Okay, for the second time, I'm gonna go a bit quicker, but we will go back to explaining them in more detail. So, if we had to summarize so far what we have, the main, by far the most important thing is proper long-term planning involving teachers and experts from the outset. That's something that really stood out in the entire research, both the qualitative and the quantitative. And the success factors, like what you should do, also go to get all actors around the table, have the big pictures like the meso, macro, meso, and micro level, create a network, address teachers' issue, make key aspects mandatory. That may sound strange, but it was really not seen as a negative. On the contrary, make some aspects mandatory so that then it will trickle down change, and ongoing cycles of professional development. This is sometimes difficult because of resources, but it's essential at the same time. The pitfalls are no long-term plan, focus on just one technique, work only from top down, small team for piloting, lack of coherence between the elements of the curriculum, and information meetings rather than collaborative workshop. These information meetings is what I call the homeopathic dilution very often of the teacher education. And this is, I've seen that happen. I've worked in Italy, France, Canada. Very often, because there is a lack of resource, so you have one workshop where there is a teacher educator and like an expert with teacher educators. And this is a level where there's quite a lot going on. The point is that these teacher educators then are supposed to go to their realities and do the same with their teachers. And it's not always working. It's a kind of cascade model. But the problem is that the more you cascade down, the more there is this dilution. And in the end, what is the message that arrived to the teacher is very different from what was said by the expert. So the idea of having everybody involved and trying to do a back and forth prevents this problem. So workshops would be much better than even communities of practice, like giving problems that teachers solve by themselves or try and solve, and then once in a while they have a meeting with a teacher educator or an expert, rather than this kind of cascade model. So what was our added value? The added value of this project? Well, apart from the fact of being a research project, is we believe that it was a way of increasing awareness about the need to share expertise, to follow this quality assurance procedure, and then to try from what we have now, these indicators that you have seen, to provide a framework to conduct QA informed feasibility studies, facilitating professional development, and understanding, support understanding of the achievement of the CFR aims. This was a nice quote from an interviewee who says, the fact that we see ourselves as learners within this project is a key to the success. In comparison, those responsible for projects so and so presented themselves like priests. This was a problem. So this is what really the teachers didn't want and didn't appreciate, that you come and preach, this is the new thing, you have to use it, but you have to see yourself as a learner, but also as contributor to the process. And I thank you for the attention. It was a bit longer, but we started a bit later. But thank you.